Alright guys, today we're going to be talking about the Yiddish Black Hand. Now first let's start off by saying the Yiddish Black Hand was not an official group. There was no boss of the Yiddish Black Hand, there weren't divisions. It was a name given to Jewish gangsters by newspapers because of the way they handled their extortions was similar to the Italian Black Hand by sending letters in black ink and crude handwriting. There was a resemblance to the way they carried things out, so they just used the name. But let's get into the story. At the dawn of the 20th century, New York's Lower East Side was flooded with newly arrived immigrants from Eastern Europe and Italy mostly. Now in these cramped tenements where you could have from 8 to 10 in a single room, that bred desperation. And with desperation often comes violence and other acts that most would find inhumane. But out of that struggle for survival, people are willing to do things they normally wouldn't be. Now, a lot of these gangs roamed the very, very tough streets of Delancey, Hester, Rivington, threatening mostly their own people. The Irish, the Italians, the Jewish all terrorized their own shopkeepers, pushcart owners, and everything in between. The earliest signs, as early as 1902, we will see signs of what would be called the Yiddish Black Hand, where letters would be slipped under doors asking for money, and if the demands weren't met, violence soon followed. At first, the actions weren't too crazy. Broken the window, merchandise knocked over, stalls pushed over, maybe a merchant gets beat up. But things escalated by the mid-1900s, where kidnappings occurred, and more famously, the widespread poisoning of horses. And you have to remember, we're talking about the early 1900s, where cars weren't the main mode of transport. It was horse and buggy. To sabotage someone's livelihood without killing them or hurting them is to not allow them to be able to move their merchandise. They would use arsenic, sometimes they would even stab the horses to death, and that would affect many businesses. Because food had to be moved quickly, refrigerators were not widespread, and ice could stay cold for only so long. This could be a death knell for any small business owner. And understanding that, there were literally hundreds of horses killed for monetary gain. Some of the early figures that gained notoriety was Joseph Toblinsky, aka the Yoski Digger, because of his darker skin, and he would actually darken it further when he was ready to drop off letters for extortion. Big Jack Zelig, Dopey Benny Fine, Charles Vitovsky, also known as Charlie the Cripple, Max Kid Twist Zwerbach, Harry Jip the Blood Horowitz, Louis Lefty Louis Rosenberg, Whitey Lewis, and a couple others. Now, Joseph Toplinsky was one of the top horse poisoners in all the land. But he didn't just stick to that. He also had no problem kidnapping children. And in 1908, he did just that, kidnapping Benny Schnapper, an 8-year-old boy in the Lower East Side, and left a note asking for $2,000, which is $70,000 roughly in today's money. The boy was released without harm after receiving a partial payment of $900. Between 1907 and 1909, the extortion that a lot of these loose gangs really reached this peak. The newspapers almost every day wrote about a new extortion or kidnapping or horse death or gun battle or fight. It was an everyday occurrence. It got to the point where the shopkeepers were actually starting to band together and form almost unions to fight back against these extortionists. And the New York Police Department, who was predominantly Irish, had to send in undercover detectives to roam the streets, pose as pushcart owners to try and catch these guys in the act. They crossed from petty thieves to an outright danger to society, and things had to be done. But because of their lack of real organization, it was inevitable for them to just turn on each other. Between 1912 and 1915, a lot of their figures were either killed by a rival faction, some were even executed by electric chair for their crimes. Jack Zelig, who for a short time was the biggest Jewish gangster outside of Arnold Rothstein, was assassinated on a trolley traveling along 2nd Avenue because he was actually set to testify against a corrupt police officer who was being tried for killing a gambler named Herman Rosenthal. After Zelig was murdered, you had other Jewish heavyweights of their own smaller gangs vying for the top position as the biggest Jewish gangster in the Lower East Side. Guys like Dopey Benny Fine, Joe the Greaser Rosenzweig, Lefty Louis Rosenberg, and Jip the Blood Horowitz had their gang, all fighting each other. In November 1914, there was a huge shootout on Grand Street, where Johnny Spanish's gang and Jip the Blood's gang were slaughtering each other in the middle of the street, decimating both factions. And a few days later, Horowitz, Rosenberg, and 2 others were executed in Sing Sing prison for a totally unrelated murder of another gambler named Sam Sheps by throwing him off a roof. Once those 4 were executed, there was no real leadership amongst these gangs. They basically dissolved and were absorbed into different organizations. Some were drafted into World War I's military draft, basically putting an end to this era of Jewish gangsterism. That's the story of the Yiddish Black Hand, as much as I could get, because it's hard to find stuff on them, to be